This time I'd like to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. O'Rourke.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I would also like to thank the chair of the subcommittee and the ranking member for sponsoring this legislation, and the chairman and ranking member of the full committee for bringing it forward. I'm pleased to be a co-sponsor of the American Heroes Cost of Living Adjustment Act, and I again want to thank the chairman and ranking member for bringing this forward. Yesterday I had the opportunity to visit Arlington National Cemetery with other members of Congress and had the opportunity to place a wreath on the tomb of the unknown soldier. This incredibly moving and grounding experience reminded me of the ultimate sacrifice given by so many of our veterans. For those that return from service wounded or develop disabilities as they age, veterans' benefits are what allow them and their families to live in some level of comfort. These modest benefits are often the difference between paying the mortgage and putting food on the table or going without. The legislation before us offers veterans security and guarantees that cost of living adjustments will happen automatically and not depend on yearly congressional approval. In addition, H.R. 570 will substantially increase benefits for the most severely disabled veterans receiving special monthly compensation. The bill also protects veterans from benefit cuts should a chain CPI index be adopted for Social Security. And while I oppose adoption of the chain CPI for Social Security, I think it is important that we act now to take the issue off the table for veterans' benefits. I represent thousands of El Paso veterans that have served our country and rely on VA benefits to make ends meet. They deserve the security of knowing that those benefits will be adjusted when their cost of living rises. I urge all of my colleagues to support this legislation. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Maine reserves. The gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Chairman, we have no other speakers at this time, so we're prepared to close if the ranking member is as well.
The gentleman from Florida reserves. The gentleman from Maine.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In closing, Mr. Speaker, H.R. 570, as amended, is a solid piece of legislation. It's one that the Veteran Service Organization supports, the committee supports, and I'd urge my colleagues to support this bill. With that, Mr. Speaker, I have no further speakers, so I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Maine yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, I once again urge all my colleagues to support H.R. 570 as amended, and I yield back the balance of our time.
The gentleman from Florida yields back the balance of his time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 570 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative. The rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Without objection, the title is amended. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arkansas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 324 as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 324, a bill to grant the Congressional Gold Medal collectively to the 1st Special Service Force in recognition of its superior service during World War II.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Cotton, and the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Arkansas.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and submit extraneous materials for the record on H.R. 324 as amended, currently under consideration.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to seek swift approval of H.R. 324, a bill to grant the Congressional Gold Medal collectively to the 1st Special Service Force in recognition of its superior service during World War II. The bill, introduced by my colleague from Florida, Mr. Miller, has 324 co-sponsors befitting the storied history of this unit. Mr. Speaker, the bravery and valor of the Army Special Forces, more commonly known as the Green Berets, are well known to most Americans. But many don't realize that this unit was born out of the 1st Special Service Force and the courageous soldiers that fought with it during World War II. The award of the Congressional Gold Medal in recognition of their heroic service will help ensure that this unit attains the historical recognition it deserves. Formed in 1942 to take on the hardest jobs in the most adverse conditions, the 1st Special Service Force was composed of both American and Canadian soldiers. The unit fought bravely in the Italian Apennine Mountains against elite German units, the 104th Panzer Grenadiers and the Hermann Göring paratroops, who were defending Hitler's Gustav Line south of Rome. They defeated German forces at Monte La Defensa after fighting south of the center of the line at Monte Cassino and participated in the successful assaults of Monte La Remontano and several nearby mountains. Sadly, of the 1,800 of the 1st Special Service Forces fighting soldiers and their 800 support troops, there were 2,300 casualties suffered in 250 combat days before the unit was disbanded in December 1944. Mr. Speaker, the men of the Special Forces fought with their faces blackened by their own boot polish. They were so feared by the Nazi defenders, they called themselves the Black Devils. And the unit took that name as its own, calling itself the Devil's Brigade. Proud of their strength and bravery, Special Forces soldiers left cards with their patch insignia and the phrase, "The worst is yet to come," on corpses in enemy territory. Following World War II, a permanent elite unit was formed based on the experiences of the Special Forces and the OSS operatives during the war. Today, that unit has evolved into the Army's Green Berets and a similar unit in Canada, the Special Operations Regiment. Mr. Speaker, today we hear stories of brave men and women in uniform defending freedom around the world. I've seen some of this awe-inspiring bravery firsthand in both Iraq and Afghanistan as a soldier myself. But as we hail our soldiers of today, let us also remember the heroism and bravery of the greatest generation during World War II. This legislation authorizes the striking and award of a single gold medal that will go to the 1st Special Service Force Association in Helena, Montana, the original training site of the 1st Special Force, and the sale of bronze duplicates of that medal. I ask for immediate passage of this legislation, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Arkansas reserves. The gentleman from Georgia.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to give great support for H.R. 324. And let me say, Mr. Speaker, at the outset that the Congressional Gold Medal is our highest honor. And there is no greater recipient that we could give this honor to than the 1st Special Service Forces, known as the Devil's Brigade. They were courageous. They risked their lives. They were the unit that helped to liberate. As a matter of fact, they led the liberation from the Nazis of France, of Italy, with daring, with courage, with skill. So it is very important for us to stand here today and to give great recognition to this unit. There is a special bond between Canada and the United States. And that special bond started in World War II. For it was the first unit and the only unit where two nations, Canada and the United States, formed a force that accomplished what many felt were impossible. You know, the Lord Jesus Christ said that there is no greater love that you can show than one who would give his life for another. What a great honor this is, Mr. Speaker, and I am just proud to join with my colleague, Mr. Miller from Florida, my good friend, and Mr. Cotton from Arkansas, to give this recognition this high nobility of purpose to the 1st unit. Today, Mr. Speaker, we are proud to have our Navy SEALs, our Green Beret, our Special Ops, those special soldiers who go where many times few others would go. But the foundation of that was the Devil's Brigade. And I can just see that, imagine that Nazi soldier who wrote that note, scared out of his wits when he called them the Black Devils, when they would go and put shoe polish on their faces so that they could be expertly disguised to go in and to help to liberate Europe from Nazi Germany. So it is with great pleasure that I stand here to join my colleagues in urging unanimous passage of this extraordinary legislation to honor this extraordinary group of soldiers. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from Georgia reserves. The gentleman from Arkansas.
I appreciate that reference to John 15:13, greater love hath no man than this, that he lay down his life for his friend. Certainly many members of the Devil's Brigade did that, as they do today in our Special Forces. And now, Mr. Speaker, I yield as much time as he may consume to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Miller, the sponsor of this legislation.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I also thank my friend Mr. Scott for his kind words. I also want to thank Chairman Hensling, the Ranking Member Waters, and Subcommittee Chairman Campbell with his Ranking Member Clay, all the members of the Financial Services Committee, and the House leadership for their support in bringing to the floor here today H.R. 324. It is a bill that grants the Congressional Gold Medal to the members of the 1st Special Service Force. I also want to thank the members of the 1st Special Service Force Association, specifically Mr. Bill Woon, for his advocacy and for the association's efforts in continuing to spread the inspirational story of a truly heroic group of American and Canadian servicemen. And I would be remiss not to thank Congressman Al Green of Texas and Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz of Florida for encouraging support from their caucus members for this broad bipartisan piece of legislation, and the 324 members of this body who have co-sponsored the bill. I join my colleagues today in support of a bill that bestows upon the 1st Special Service Force the Congressional Gold Medal. It's Congress's highest expression of national appreciation for distinguished achievement and contributions for their superior service during World War II. The 1st Special Service Force was a covert World War II military unit born through the efforts of President Franklin Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill. The force conducted ultra-high-risk military missions in Italy and in France. Once sent into action, the 1st Special Service Force never failed a combat mission. The 1st Special Service Force achieved remarkable success in battle and contributed prominently in the liberation of Italy and of France. Most notably, the force conducted battles south of Cassino, including Monte La Defensa and Monte Maio, 2 mountain peaks critical to the German defensive line. During the night of December 3rd of 1943, the force ascended to the top of the precipitous face of Monte La Defensa, where the force suffered heavy casualties and overcame fierce resistance to overtake the German line. The 1st Special Service Force lost a total of 2,314 men, which was 134% of the original combat force. These heroic servicemen represent the breadth, intrepidity, and courage, and they have earned our country's deepest gratitude and highest praise. Though many of the brave troops of the 1st Special Service Force have been lost to us, this gold medal is an important step in immortalizing their service and honoring the forefathers of today's Special Forces. With just 6 days remaining until Memorial Day, I cannot think of a more appropriate way to honor the heroism and sacrifice of the warriors of the 1st Special Service Force, and I urge all of my colleagues to support this important piece of legislation. And to all of the men and women who have guarded our great nation in the name of protecting and defending liberty that we hold so dear, we say thank you. And to all of those who have given the ultimate sacrifice, may you forever remain in our hearts and in our prayers. And with that, I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Arkansas reserves. The gentleman from Georgia.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I have no further speakers, and I just take this opportunity to join all of us in the Congress of the United States to salute the 1st Service Special Forces for the outstanding work that they have done. And I urge unanimous passage on this legislation. Thank you.
Does the gentleman yield the balance of his time?
Yes, I yield back.
The gentleman from Georgia yields the balance of his time. The gentleman from Arkansas.
I yield myself the balance of my time, and I join my colleagues, gentlemen from Georgia and the gentleman from Florida, in urging unanimous passage of this very important legislation the week before Memorial Day to honor the Devil's Brigade. I reserve the balance of my time.
Does the gentleman yield the balance of his time?
Yes, I yield the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Arkansas yields the balance of his time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 324 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative.
Mr. Speaker, I request the yeas and nays.
The gentleman from Arkansas is recognized.
I request the yeas and nays on this question.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. After a sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Indiana seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1344 as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 1344, a bill to amend Title 49, United States Code, to direct the Assistant Secretary of Homeland Security, Transportation Security Administration to provide expedited air passenger screening to severely injured or disabled members of the armed forces and severely injured or disabled veterans, and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentlewoman from Indiana, Mrs. Brooks, and the gentlewoman from Hawaii, Ms. Gabbard, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Indiana.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and include any extraneous material on the bill under consideration.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
As a member of the Committee on Homeland Security's Transportation Security Subcommittee, I am proud to be a co-sponsor of this common-sense piece of legislation that will increase accessibility and privacy for our wounded warriors at airport checkpoints. This legislation directs TSA to develop and implement a process to facilitate the ease of travel and, to the extent possible, provide expedited screening through our nation's airports for severely injured or disabled members of the armed forces and veterans. The last thing our heroes need is to face unnecessary scrutiny or hassle, or be forced to answer endless questions about their conditions, when all they want to do is board a plane to fly home to their loved ones or maybe to a job interview. This bill would ensure that our wounded warriors, those dedicated men and women who have been severely injured while fighting to protect our nation, are treated with the highest dignity and respect when traveling through our nation's airports. I was pleased to find out that shortly after Administrator Pistol testified before the Transportation Security Subcommittee on TSA's efforts to advance risk-based security, TSA began to offer expedited screening services to severely injured members of the armed forces and veterans, provided they contact the TSA in advance of traveling. While I support TSA's newly adopted protocols, I feel this bill is necessary because it codifies current TSA policy and ensures that it will remain intact during future administrations. Mr. Speaker, this bill not only benefits severely injured and disabled members of the United States Armed Forces, veterans, and their accompanying families, but it also supports the TSA administrator's intent to develop a more risk-based method of screening for all passengers. Expediting travel for our military heroes is an important step toward reasonable transportation security reforms that allow us to focus precious taxpayer dollars on the unknown travelers and the real threats. As we look forward to this upcoming Memorial Day, let us honor the all too often painful sacrifices our wounded warriors have made for our nation by adopting this important and common sense piece of legislation. I urge my colleagues to support the bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from Indiana reserves. The gentlewoman from Hawaii.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in strong support of H.R. 1344, the Helping Heroes Fly Act, and yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in strong support of H.R. 1344. In response to documented grievances my fellow service members made because of various challenges and trying experiences that they went through at airport checkpoints across the country, I introduced the Helping Heroes Fly Act to ensure that the Transportation Security Agency, working alongside with veterans advocacy organizations, develop sensible screening policies that honor and respect the service and sacrifice of our nation's injured and disabled heroes. On March 27th of this year, just a few days after this legislation was introduced, the Transportation Security Administration made an announcement of some improvements that they'd made in this area as they took steps to expedite airport screening for severely injured members of our armed forces. With these changes, individuals can presently request assistance ahead of time and move through security checkpoints without having to remove their shoes, light outerwear, jackets, or hats. Taking off a jacket, while maybe a simple inconvenience for you and I, can be a very physically challenging task for someone who, for example, has lost the use of an arm. While this announcement was a good step, it didn't go nearly far enough, as there are still more improvements that need to be made. As I've spoken with wounded warriors and listened to their experiences, I've heard stories that have been varied and included things like having to take off a prosthetic leg, putting the leg through the X-ray machine, and then having to balance on one leg, going through the full body scan without help from anyone. This is unacceptable. Severely injured and disabled active duty and veterans both experience widely varied screening protocols among different airports and even among screeners in the same airport. This makes it very hard for a wounded warrior to anticipate and prepare what will be required of them to make sure that they are ready physically and mentally. Again, this may not seem like much to us, but to someone, a trained and hardened warrior, learning to adjust to these severe injuries can sometimes be difficult and can be the difference between a smooth and dignified screening experience or one that is filled with frustration, shame, and pain for the injured service member and delays for all people waiting in that screening line. Another issue that's frequently come up has been privacy. Veterans have shared with me their own experiences of having to take off prosthetics despite TSA guidance that it's not necessary. And in the instances where extra screening of these prosthetics is necessary, it's been done in public view, even when clothing needs to be removed. No one should be required to remove their shirt or pants in public, nor should scans of sensitive or private areas be viewed by other airline passengers. Again, this has been already a humiliating, shameful experience for some veterans when there's absolutely no requirement or necessity for it. The Disabled American Veterans have spoken in strong support of this legislation, stating at some airports our amputee members receive relaxed screening, while at others these screenings are horrific. Perhaps it's TSA's purpose to make screenings unpredictable. Some screenings have required these amputees expose their prosthesis when they lack the ability to reposition their clothing, and TSA agents are not allowed to help them, nor do they allow spouses or traveling companions to enter search areas to assist them. So our objective with this legislation is to ensure consistent treatment by screeners, greater attention to privacy concerns, and consulting with these advocacy organizations who speak for our wounded warriors and make sure that they have a voice in the process. This bill before us today, the Helping Heroes Fly Act, achieves these improvements by requiring TSA take into account the privacy of the individual being screened. It also mandates training of screening officers on the expedited protocols to make sure that no matter where you travel, no matter what city you're in, you will have consistent screening procedures so you know what to expect. TSA is also required to consult with these advocacy organizations to make sure that as these changes are implemented, that the unique needs of our wounded warriors are implemented to the best of its ability. To ensure these changes over the long term, this legislation requires regular reporting to Congress, as well as maintenance of the TSA's operations center that these wounded warriors and veterans can contact for assistance as they prepare to travel. Mr. Speaker, as you well know, members of our U.S. Armed Forces are entrusted to protect the security of our country with their lives. By definition, these individuals pose very little risk to aviation security and should be consistently screened in a manner befitting and honoring their service and sacrifice. So I urge my colleagues to ensure our nation's wounded warriors are treated respectfully and urge them to vote yes in support of H.R. 1344. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from Hawaii reserves. The gentlewoman from Indiana.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins.
The gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate you yielding on this. And I appreciate not only the gentlewoman from Indiana, but the gentlewoman from Hawaii for bringing this legislation. I bring a little bit of different perspective to this. As a chaplain in the military and working with our heroes who have been wounded and coming from bodies that were strong and healthy and vibrant to a situation in which now they're put in a position that they've never had to, and in some ways a dependency, and counseling in those roles, and seeing them having to go through this process which is inconsistent and frankly unfair. I think this is a reason I strongly support this legislation, but I also support it from a different perspective. As having a daughter who has been in a wheelchair since she was able to walk, as we call it, roll, she's never known anything different. And so we've had to adjust over time, and she's adjusted in ways of going through screenings and going through processes like that. But when you balance what our wounded warriors, heroes who come home who had healthy bodies and now have bodies that are not healthy, this is something that will provide them a measure of dignity, and it is an honor to stand here and support this legislation, because I believe that an inconsistency in this area is an inconsistency in what we believe as Americans and what those men and women have done for us. We have to remember that in times of war now, it is not like it used to be where these would actually have died on the battlefield. Now they're coming home. They're coming home to live productive lives, great lives, because of the sacrifices that they have made. It is time that we, and this legislation proves this, to stand for them and the fairness that they deserve for what they have given to us. And I just congratulate the gentlewoman from Hawaii and also from Indiana for sponsoring this, and I look forward to voting for it and encouraging my colleagues to do so. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from Indiana reserves. The gentlewoman from Hawaii.
Mr. Speaker, I yield such time as she may consume to the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Border and Maritime Security of the Committee on Homeland Security, the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
The gentlewoman from Texas is recognized.
Ask unanimous consent to address the House, revise, and extend.
Without objection.
Thank you. Speaker, I am so pleased to be able to come to the floor today as we approach this week that we memorialize those fallen heroes, and as well, at the same time, acknowledge those who yet live, who have served, who are wounded. And even today, as we stand on the floor in the backdrop of enormous tragedies among our civilian population in Oklahoma over the last couple of days and in Texas and elsewhere, this is an important, very important legislative initiative. And as the former ranking member and chair of the Subcommittee on Transportation Security and a co-sponsor, I rise in strong support of H.R. 1344, the Helping Heroes Fly Act of 2013, and I congratulate my colleague, my new colleague, for this outstanding legislation, Ms. Gabbard from Hawaii. Thank you very much. And to the manager, thank you very much. It's important, and I'm glad we're standing here together in a bipartisan manner. I support this legislation because it eases and facilitates expedited passenger screening at airports for service members who are severely injured or disabled, along with their families. And, of course, the thoughtfulness in introducing this legislation is, of course, appreciated because it's necessary legislation. I thank you for indicating that even as the TSA, of which we have oversight over, is formulating policies, it's good to codify it, to make it law, because these heroes deserve their law. The Helping Heroes Fly Act requires Transportation Security Administration to maintain an operational center to provide support and facilitate the movement of these disabled service members and veterans, and it requires TSA to publish protocols so disabled service members and veterans and their families will be able to contact the Operations Center and request expedited screening. The bill also requires that these protocols be integrated into the training of TSA agents. Now, I know that there are many home ports, if you will, for our returning heroes. I happen to know that Texas has had a very large number of our men and women go to Iraq and Afghanistan and places beyond. I've been to Hawaii and know the transition there of many who are coming on R&R from places around the world. And I know that there is a place where many come home because it was their home. And yes, they come home disabled with prosthesis and other wounds that require their privacy. I'm glad that this bill acknowledged that not only are they a hero, but they are desirous and they are deserving of the respect. Why don't I say an admiration and commendation and respect again of those who would expedite them going into a secured area. Mr. Speaker, more than 2.2 million veterans, 1 in 10, have been disabled or seriously wounded in the service of our nation. And disabled veterans typically find it much harder, by some estimates twice as hard, to readjust to civilian life. The least we can do for these heroes is to make it a little less burdensome and difficult to navigate the obstacles, barriers, and checkpoints that have been erected in the aftermath of 9/11 to enhance the security of air travel, and rightly so. But most of these inconveniences are necessary, but no less burdensome. To those who suffered physical disabilities, defending the nation from those who would make air travel dangerous and deadly. Let's give them respect for what they have done to secure the homeland and to make us safer. The legislation before us strikes an appropriate balance and between these competing interests. I have seen the operation of TSA and TSO officers and some of what they call these specialty officers. Allow me to thank you publicly for the work you've already done and the sensitivity you've done. I've seen these soldiers, these heroes, coming home at DCA, at Dulles. I've certainly seen them in the airports in Texas. I've seen them in their uniforms. I've seen them, as I said, disabled. I've seen them with families. I saw one young man who was wandering in my airport and obviously in uniform, but had not a good day. I don't know what might have been impacting him. But we stopped, and I hailed over an officer in uniform, a TSO officer, and said, you won't be alone now. We're going to find out where you need to go. One of the factors of this particular legislative initiative that is good is that wherever you land sometimes, it may not be your home airport. Every airport is different, and I think they work themselves up to make sure that they work to make it exciting and confusing. Thank you for the Helping Heroes Act to help improve airport security screening processes for wounded and severely disabled service members, but also thank you for giving them a helping hand. You're helping the veterans as well. And this authorizes a Wounded Warrior Screening Program and requires TSA to maintain an operations center. These improvements will facilitate and expedite air travel for our disabled veterans and service members. More importantly, they help our nation's heroes to be shown the respect, as I said earlier, and the appreciation of a nation that is so grateful. Mr. Speaker, I strongly support this legislation and urge all my colleagues to join me in voting for the Helping Heroes Fly Act of 2013. I'm glad to be back in the well again in this year, or this week, of honoring our soldiers and those who have fallen, and I'm delighted for the leadership of my colleague on the Homeland Security Committee and the manager on this great bill, and I hope that we have a very strong vote. I yield back my time.
The gentlewoman yields back. The gentlewoman from Hawaii reserves. The gentlewoman from Indiana.
Mr. Speaker, I am very pleased to be yielding 2 minutes of my time to a distinguished gentleman who has also served his country admirably in the military, and someone who also serves on the Homeland Security Committee with Congresswoman Gabbard and myself, the distinguished gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to start out by thanking the gentleladies from Indiana and, of course, from Hawaii for this very significant and impactful legislation, and particularly privileged to speak in favor of this, and knowing that Ms. Gabbard from Hawaii currently serves as a comrade in arms, just like myself, currently right today. You know, TSA started an expedited screening program in 2011 called PreCheck, but just recently expanded the program to include active duty members of the military, and most recently, just this March, to severely injured members of the military. And I must say that having served with some of these members, as a matter of fact, there's a member of this House that was severely injured, and I served right along her soldiers. I flew with those soldiers in Iraq myself. Many of these injured soldiers, service members, want to continue to serve. They want to. Desperately. That's their calling in life, but they cannot, for their own good and for the good of the mission. But their heart's in the right place. And so, while it's great that the TSA has recognized severely injured members of the military in that regard, what about these veterans who want to serve but cannot continue to serve? And this bill rightfully extends similar benefits to severely injured or disabled veterans and members of the armed forces. Increased and more stringent security is understandable in the wake of 9/11, and it's kind of a bitter irony that many of these members that have been severely injured joined just because of those events. And now, how ironic is it that they are caught up in this web of security for the injuries they received because they answered the call of their country. Service members, I know, don't ask for special recognition or any recognition for being soldiers or service members, and certainly not for the injuries they received or have received as a result of their service. And so I stand in very strong support of this legislation. I thank the gentleladies from Indiana and Hawaii, and I urge all my colleagues to vote yes for this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from Indiana reserves. The gentlewoman from Hawaii.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Swalwell.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 3 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to support H.R. 1344, the Helping Heroes Fly Act. I'm a proud sponsor of this bipartisan legislation introduced by my friend Congresswoman Gabbard. Congresswoman Gabbard is a person who knows a thing or two about what it's like to be a combat veteran who comes back from the battlefield and who has to use our airports. Fortunately, she is back in one piece, but we know all too well many of our veterans are not, and this bill eases their ability to move throughout our airports. It would extend benefits similar to the expedited PreCheck program to severely injured or disabled veterans and members of the armed services who fly through TSA screening at airports. As it stands now, many of our nation's wounded warriors report that screening protocols aren't properly standardized at airports around the nation. Consistent treatment by screeners would help create certainty for the newly injured and give greater attention to addressing their privacy concerns. Despite TSA guidance to the contrary, some veterans report having been required to take off prosthetics in public view during screenings. This is a difficult process that our injured and veterans should not have to endure. In January, I met with Staff Sergeant Jason Ross from Livermore, California, from my district. Sergeant Ross was severely injured by an IED while honorably serving in Afghanistan and lost both of his legs. This bill would help ease the transition back home for wounded warriors and heroes like Sergeant Ross. The continued sacrifice and selfless service of our nation's heroes, a group Sergeant Ross exemplifies with distinction, is immeasurable. That's why we as a nation must live up to our responsibilities to properly support the men and women of our armed forces when they return home. We must leave no soldier behind, and we owe our troops more than just thank you for your service. Today, it is too easy to spend money, and we spend over $1 billion a year recruiting people into our armed services, while we are not doing enough to take care of them and keep the promises we make, whether it's providing GI funding or making sure that disability claims are taken care of. Currently, the average wait time for a disability claim ranges between 316 and 327 days. This is far too long. The Oakland VA, which serves the veterans in my district, has one of the worst backlogs in the nation. At a time when our wounded warriors are left waiting so long to receive the care that they have rightly earned, helping to ensure that our nation's heroes are able to travel seamlessly and without hindrance when they return home is a step we must take. I want to thank again my colleague, Congresswoman Gabbard from Hawaii, for sponsoring this bill. I'll always support legislation that helps our returning service members and their families receive the care and thanks they were promised and have earned. I urge my colleagues to vote for the Helping Heroes Fly Act, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from Hawaii reserves. Gentlewoman from Indiana.
Mr. Speaker, I have no further speakers. If the gentlewoman from Hawaii has no further speakers, I'm prepared to close once the gentlewoman does.
The gentlewoman reserves. The gentlewoman from Hawaii.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's been an honor to stand here on the floor today in a bipartisan manner with my colleagues. I want to thank the gentlewoman from Indiana for managing this and her strong support and advocacy for this issue, which is symbolic of us taking action to honor our heroes, especially as we head into Memorial Day. You've heard from many members why this is a good bill and why it should pass. It's been subject to scrutiny by all the stakeholders, and it has resulted in a bill that will be efficient and effective. One example of steps we have taken to make sure that this is an efficient bill is making sure that as we provide training as a central requirement to make sure that the consistency in all airports exists, the provision requiring employee training was modified to make it clear that only screening personnel who participate in these expedited services will be mandatory, required to be trained under this bill, as opposed to requiring every single employee of the TSA to be trained, even when their job has nothing to do with passenger screening responsibilities. This modification ensures that the department's limited resources are spent in the most efficient manner, while also ensuring the consistent policies and treatment that is our objective of this legislation. I'd like to take a moment to highlight the support that this bill has gotten from veteran organizations. In addition to the Disabled American Veterans, I also have letters of support from the Wounded Warrior Project, the American Legion, and the Paralyzed Veterans of America. The Wounded Warrior Project sums it up perfectly as they say wounded warriors should not have to sacrifice their privacy, encounter conflicting screening policies and procedures, or be subject to significant travel delays. We welcome the steps proposed in H.R. 1344 to foster expedited screening and to protect the privacy of our wounded warriors going through this process. We also commend the proposal to require the TSA to continue to consult with veteran service organizations as they develop these improved screening processes. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the letters from these organizations be entered into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And before yielding back, I just want to take a moment to thank the chairman of the committee, Mr. McCall, and the ranking member, Benny Thompson, whose strong support for this bill allowed it to move very quickly and to be considered on the floor here today. Subcommittee Chairman Mr. Hudson and Ranking Member Richmond, as well as Sheila Jackson Lee, along with my colleague Ms. Brooks from Indiana, have also been incredible champions and supporters. Last but not least, I'd like to take a moment to recognize Senior Professional Staff Brian Turbyfill, who's been invaluable in providing his assistance and guiding this bill through the process. Mr. Speaker, this is a common sense measure that aligns with the intelligence-driven, risk-based approach to security that TSA is striving for. It addresses a clearly identified problem and provides a solution that will serve and honor the sacrifices of our nation's selfless heroes and great servant leaders. I ask my colleagues to support this bill and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from Hawaii yields back the balance of her time. The gentlewoman from Indiana.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of myself as well as Congressman McCall, the chair of the Homeland Security Committee, we would like to commend Congresswoman Gabbard of Hawaii, not only for her service in moving this issue, but for her military service. I'm very proud to be serving with her, and we are so pleased that this is being done in such a bipartisan manner. And Ms. Congresswoman from Hawaii and I have enjoyed a new, strong friendship, and I hope there are many more bills to come that we can work on together. I must say that we know that there are so many brave men and women throughout this country who've been severely injured while fighting. In fact, according to the Employment and Disability Institute at Cornell University, there are 6,800 working-age civilian veterans in Indiana alone who have had the most severe service-connected disability rating. And this past weekend, when I was out at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway in honor of Armed Forces Day on Sunday, and as we swore in the young men and women who have agreed to step up and serve in the National Guard, and they were reporting to basic training that day, I knew that this bill was on the House floor this week. And it was quite emotional to see these young men and women who we know are, between them and their families, are providing the most incredible sacrifice. And I just am very pleased that we are working on this bill in this manner. To sit by while one of these heroes, and to me, all of these young 18 to 22-year-olds that I saw in front of me are heroes. And we pray that they will not be injured, but those who are injured and who provide that incredible sacrifice cannot be treated like potential enemies at our own airports. Here at home, and particularly at our airports, it should put us all to shame. Our wounded warriors are a special group of citizens in this country. They are a trusted group of citizens, and we can and must do more to treat them as such and to recognize their commitment to our nation. With the Memorial Day holiday fast approaching, this bill is a timely tribute to their sacrifice. I must also say that this weekend at the Indianapolis 500, before the race, it is the most moving ceremony when our armed services march down pit lane. And many people, the 250,000 people who will be there, say it is probably the most moving ceremony they have ever witnessed. And so we look not only for the safety this weekend at our race, but it is a wonderful reminder of the incredible sacrifice all of the men and women in the military give day in and day out. I urge my colleagues to vote in favor of H.R. 1344 as amended, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from Indiana yields back the balance of her time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 1344 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative. The rules are suspended. The bill is passed.
Mr. Speaker, on that I request the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by yeas and nay will rise and remain standing until counted. After a sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed. Okay, all right. For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass the bill S-982, the Freedom to Fish Act.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Senate 982, an act to prohibit the Corps of Engineers from taking certain actions to establish a restricted area, prohibiting public access to waters downstream of a dam and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Schuster, and the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Napolitano, each control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on S-982.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
S-982, the Freedom to Fish Act, would prohibit the Corps of Engineers from restricting public access to the vicinity of the 10 dams on the Cumberland River in Kentucky and Tennessee. This legislation was introduced in the Senate by the leader, Senator McConnell, and also by Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky, and on our own in the House, authored by our colleague Ed Whitfield from Kentucky. The bill provides for a 2-year moratorium to give the public, the 2 states, and the Corps of Engineers more time to carefully review conditions at these facilities and to deal with the immediate threat to fishing, tourism, and the economy. I applaud our leadership for bringing this legislation to the floor today. This is an excellent example of Congress exercising our constitutional authority to oversee federal agencies. Far too often, the executive branch and the federal bureaucracy operate without input and guidance from Congress. My colleagues on the floor of this House every day criticize rules, regulations, and actions by unelected bureaucrats that hurt our districts, our constituents, and our economy. Congress has the right, the constitutional duty, to oversee federal agencies and provide them with clear guidance and direction. As chairman of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, problems with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers are frequently brought to my attention by my colleagues from both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats. I am pleased to work whenever possible to address these issues with clear guidance from Congress. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Pennsylvania reserves. The gentlewoman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Pending measure was introduced in the Senate on May 16th of this year, 2013, and passed the very same day. While the bill is apparently a Senate revised version of the legislation introduced in February of 2013, no committee hearings or markups were held on either bill. Since 1996, the Corps the Army Corps of Engineers has been required to establish restricted areas for hazardous waters upstream and downstream of all Corps dams. As written, S-982 would revise the current agency policy and would also prohibit the Army Corps of Engineers from establishing any restricted areas in hazardous waters at dams and other structures in the Cumberland River Basin for a period of 2 years, and also require them to remove any physical barriers that already exist to prevent access to the hazardous areas. If, after the 2-year moratorium, the Corps decides to implement new restricted areas around these dams and other structures, it would continue to be prohibited from erecting any physical barriers to prevent people from entering hazardous areas. Currently, the Corps, Madam Speaker, I do have serious concerns over this piece of legislation because it does pose risk for public safety and national security. Currently, the Corps restricts access to certain areas above and below the dams of the Cumberland River Basin in order to keep people from being sucked into the spillways or from having their boats swamped or sunk by unplanned releases from the hydropower units, which are very, very much untimed. The reasons they do this is very simple: to prevent people from drowning and to restrict access to federal dams that would be targets for terrorism or destruction. Without full-time law enforcement patrols, areas above and below dams are not constantly monitored, and the Corps has not been able to alert and rescue people who get into trouble. They have to base it on people who are in boats nearby to help effect a rescue. 14 people drowned in the last few years, and there have been 20 near misses where there is no Corps staff to help. In fact, according to a report by WRCB-TV in Chattanooga, Tennessee, since 2009, there have been 3 fatalities in the hazardous waters immediately downstream of those dams on Cumberland River. The waters are so hazardous at these locations that wearing a life jacket is ineffective, and I repeat, ineffective. To legislatively preclude a federal agency from protecting public health and national security seems a very unwise course of action, and I have significant concerns about the precedent that would be set by this legislation. Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Kentucky, the author of the House version of this bill. You own 3 minutes.
The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized for 3 minutes.
Well, Chairman Schuster, I want to thank you and Ranking Member Napolitano for agreeing to bring this important legislation to the floor. I will tell you, last September, the Army Corps of Engineers made a decision that the 10 dams located on the Cumberland River, that they would put up a barrier of fishing near these dams in the tailwaters. And despite opposition from the governors of Tennessee and Kentucky, the Fish and Wildlife Service of Kentucky and Tennessee, Senator Alexander, Senator Corker, Congressman Jim Cooper, Marsha Blackburn of Tennessee, Steve Fincher, myself, Rand Paul, Mitch McConnell, and others, we wrote letters to the Corps. We had public meetings with the Corps. We sent petitions to the Corps. We had phone calls with the Corps and asked them to delay the implementation, primarily because of the sequestration and the amount of money that it would take to put these barriers up, which almost would be $3 million. Despite our best efforts, and we had meetings in which 400 or 500 people attended, they refused to delay the implementation. So I rise today to support this Senate bill because it delays the implementation for 2 years. And I want to thank the gentlelady for bringing up the safety issue. All of us are very much concerned about the safety issue. But I would like to point out that in the 42 years of the history of these dams on the Cumberland River in Tennessee and Kentucky, there have been 881 drownings in the collective lakes and waters, not including the area immediately around the dam. There have only been 14 drownings, and any drowning is too many, but in 42 years around the dam where they are focused on, there have been 14 drownings. And I might say that of those 14 drownings, 5 of them occurred on the banks, 2 of them were of unknown causes, 3 were because people were not even wearing life jackets, 3 were because they were wearing the life jackets improperly, and only 1 drowning occurred in 42 years where the person was wearing the life jacket properly. So I would say to the Corps, the real safety issue relates to the collective waters, not around the dams. And of course, we all are very much concerned about protecting the homeland security. And I will tell you, in these very rural areas of Tennessee and Kentucky, where these dams are located, many people are out there fishing, and my time's expired. Okay.
The gentleman is recognized for an additional minute.
Thank you. These are very rural areas, and I will tell you that the Fish and Wildlife Service provide a great deal of protection and enforcement of broken laws in this area. And many of these people are quite familiar with each other, and so I'm not going to be able to address the Homeland Security issue in detail, except that it is enforced. Many of the people who fish there through the fishing competitions and for the economic growth know each other. But on the safety issue, I would just say 14 drownings in 42 years around the dam itself, 881 in other areas. And so we're not asking that this be a permanent restriction. We're simply asking the Corps to work with the governors, the Fish and Wildlife Services of both states, the Senate and the House, and local county judges to address in a more permanent way. And so I would respectfully request that you approve this Senate bill, which was simply delayed for 2 years for additional study. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentlewoman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It would be nice to know why the Army Corps has not really been effective in getting back to the parties that have asked for information and working with them. It would be very much interesting to know whether or not it's because of sequestration or budget, whatever. But might dive into it later. I'd like to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Tennessee, Congressman Cooper.
The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding. This is a completely bipartisan measure, and I hope that we have an overwhelming vote in support of it. The Freedom to Fish Act is a very responsible piece of legislation put forward in the Senate by my colleague, Senator Lamar Alexander. In the hearing on the Senate side, Senator Feinstein pointed out to the Army Corps of Engineers witness how reasonable Senator Alexander was trying to be, how reasonable this approach was. So I think we can say with some certainty that this is something that should be overwhelmingly supported by this House. For my colleagues, the Cumberland River is perhaps unknown to you. It's a beautiful river. Every elected official that I'm aware of in our area, Democrat and Republican, supports this legislation. Safety is an issue, but so is overreaching by our friends at the Corps. Occasionally they're a little bit tone deaf, especially if they get transferred in and out a little bit too quickly. This is an amazing little way to fish here.